Okay. So hello everyone again. Um, Welcome to the conference. My name is Fobazi Ettarh, and today I will be giving the keynote talk, Resisting Vocational Awe, Reframing the Role of the Instructor. So I got a lovely introduction from Jillian and the rest of the amazing team. And here is where you can find me. Twitter is usually the best bet. And please feel free to, tweet and share whatever you might want to do. You can tweet at me, whatever it is, throughout the session and onwards. For some of my more longer works, I have a blog as well as where I put some of the previous presentations that I've done in the past on my website. And finally, you can always, go old school and just email me. Emailing back might take a bit just because, again, I am about to start my PhD and I'm starting to get a lot of emails, but I will do my best to reply when I can. And so before we begin, I just want to say that this keynote might cause a little bit of discomfort. I would ask that you embrace the discomfort. There's a reason they call it growing pains, as it were. Growth is something that can be difficult, can be hard, especially when it comes to vocational awe, because it underpins a lot of the narrative of librarianship in a similar way that some might argue information literacy does, right? Info lit is the bread and butter of librarianship. A lot of library roles have some sort of instruction as a part of it. And so when we talk about instruction, when we talk about librarianship, it can be hard to hear what the things that we are doing that aren't necessarily the greatest for our patrons. And so, again, growing pains are a good thing, even though pain and discomfort are part of it. And moving on to my next point, right? Feelings are great. I would never tell you not to feel your feelings. I would never say, defensiveness is a bad reaction to have. All I would say is that sometimes when conversations become only about feelings, it can end up getting away from the amazing work that needs to be done in order to actually change behaviors. And so I would try and say to perhaps focus on the ways in which the feelings can be moved towards actionable items. All right, and so to begin, right, we have to talk about the instructor and what does it actually mean in terms of libraries and the classroom. And so I took this quote from the Guidelines for Instruction Programs in Academic Libraries. Academic libraries work to participate in, support, and achieve the educational mission of their institutions by teaching the core competencies of information literacy. And so what does this mean? So to break it down a little more, right? The mission of many instruction librarians, or whatever your title may be, right, is to support the educational objective of the institution. The objective of a science and engineering library will be very different than the objective of a theater and fine arts or performing arts library. And library instructors are asked to teach the core competencies of information literacy. So again, accessing and finding information, evaluating that information for accuracy and some of the other aspects. And, as I will talk about later, hopefully moving past just accuracy to more about how it fits into cultural and social context as well. And finally, instruction librarians, or again, whatever your title may be, right, hope to engender that ability and desire for lifelong learning. I'm sure that many of us would agree that these three things alone are a big ask for many people, right? And as unfortunately many of us know, these three things are only the tip of the iceberg of what the responsibilities are for library instructors. And so, right, in reality, many instructors are treated like secretaries. Either the professor will use us as a sort of backup lesson plan, the sort of academic equivalent of rolling in the giant TV with the movie for the day. They will not necessarily respect our time in terms of asking us for lesson plans, perhaps the day before, or asking us to come into the classroom the day of. In addition to being treated like secretaries, there is a lot of precarity in instruction work, in the actual job titles, whether it's something like coordinator syndrome, where you have a lot of collaboration, but not necessarily a lot of ownership over the work that you get to do, whether it's precarity built into the actual job, whether it's non-tenure track or it's part-time. Lots of instruction tends to be seen as something that can be done almost on the side, as it were. On the flip side, instruction librarians and other instructors often have to take on a lot of work, especially with doing a one-shot program. You might find yourself doing 30, 40, 50, 80 one-shots in a semester, because of the fact that they just isn't staffing usually for the amount of instruction that ends up being a need at colleges and universities, or whatever the spaces that you all might be in. And all that entails is that these instruction programs are held together with spit and glue, as it were. The sheer drive of doing more with less, whether it's that doing more with less is being top down, put upon the workers, or whether it's the workers themselves who see just how much work is necessary and try to do their best to reach as much as they can. And so what unfortunately our reality ends up encouraging or enforcing is this idea that grit and resilience are what is necessary to be instructors, to be successful instructors. And so resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. It means bouncing back from difficult experiences. And so again, while on the surface, that doesn't necessarily seem like a bad thing, right? We don't want anyone to feel like they're falling apart under the amount of work that they are being asked to do or being asked to endure with all of the other things in their life. And yet, what happens when grit and resilience become a part of the sort of instruction norms is that it often ties into a deficit model of education where failure is due to internal deficits. And this is both for our students as well as ourselves. In any situations where we don't have enough resilience, it is seen as an internal deficit. Or if there's any situations that are occurring outside of the classroom, outside of the library, that is very much affecting the way that workflows function, whether it be a political thing that's happening in the larger world, whether it be organizational traumas that are happening, things like reorganizations, things like union strikes and trying to gain unions or re-up the collective bargaining agreement, whatever it might be. There are so many different things that affect the classroom. And by using this deficit model, all we're doing is, again, putting the failures on ourselves rather than acknowledging all of these things that are out there. In addition to deficit model, the growth mindset basically states that there is always room to have this growth, which again sounds great on the surface, except for the fact that it's still coming from a very individualistic standpoint, a very interpersonal standpoint, and not necessarily acknowledging the various systems of oppression that exist and intersect with classroom management and classroom instruction. Eamon Toole, I would definitely suggest checking out his work. He has done a lot of work on how grit and resilience play a large role in librarianship, in librarian instruction programs, and why these narratives are not necessarily a good thing. And so again, the problem with grit and resilience is that any and all problems are caused through interpersonal interactions, rather than acknowledging all of the various systems of oppression that have very real impacts on the classroom itself. It ignores systemic inequality and injustices. And again, the burden of having grit and resilience always falls on those who are most marginalized. Whether it's, for example, during this pandemic, and having librarianship be a very feminized profession, things like childcare and just all of the stressors of motherhood aren't necessarily seen as real things that can impact an instruction program or an instructor. And the idea is, again, that you just need more grit and more resilience rather than more institutional support, whether that's financial support, whether that's staffing support, and those who have the most problems, right, aren't necessarily able to articulate all of the things that they have to have grit and resilience for. Whereas, you know, our male counterparts who may not have been doing as much childcare or who may not have been doing as much of the household work may not see all of the burdens, right, and overwork that is being put on us as instructors. And so moving on to vocational awe, right? Is librarianship an occupation or a vocation? When we think about education, we know very much that our teachers are seen as being within a vocation. Teaching and education is very much seen as a sacred duty. And so, although occupation and vocation have similar meanings, the connotations are very different. An occupation is a job or career that you go to, whereas a vocation is seen as a strong inclination towards a path or a mission, in that the earliest definitions were literally vocation was literally defined as the ways in which people respond to God's call. And so I'm a pastor's kid. Shout out to any PKs in the audience. There's usually at least one. And so as we pastor's kids know, church is, you never really leave church. Even if you're not in the building, you're always still in church, whether it's Sunday school, whether it's Bible study, whether it's women's retreats or men's retreats or youth retreats. Even during the summer, there's vacation Bible school, right? While, again, church is a building, it's definitely also a culture. And so knowing all of these things, would we say that librarianship is an occupation or a vocation? As you might imagine, right, we as a field very much treat librarianship as a vocation rather than an occupation. And so knowing that, vocational awe is the, it describes a set of ideas, values, and assumptions that librarians have about themselves and the profession, which result in notions that libraries as institutions are inherently good and sacred, and therefore beyond critique. And so breaking this down, libraries are inherently good. I mean, they provide access to all, have diverse collections, champion truth and free speech, unless they're undesirable. And when we talk about the undesirable, we mean both in materials and in actual people, whether it's the fact that libraries, both public and academic libraries, were segregated for the longest time, and that sit-ins, again, happen not just in schools, but within libraries, and that many libraries actually closed rather than integrate. Or whether it's the ways that our policy shows that those who don't have a bank account can't sign up for a library card, or those who don't have a government license with a picture ID have a much harder time gaining access to the materials. Whether it's the capitulation to pressures from outside forces. Right now, it's June, it's Pride Month. We have seen over and over again how there are groups and organizations who are doing campaigns like Hide the Pride, where they're trying to take out all of the books that deal with LGBTQ issues, LGBTQ people, and either throw them out, take them home and never bring them back. And so as libraries, not just having the collection isn't enough if we don't actually protect the people who need the collection. It's not welcome to all, right? If we're talking, moving on to the inherently sacred, where we see stories, right, with like with Ukraine and with Uvalde, of librarians who open their libraries, open their buildings to the community to be a safe space, to be a sanctuary. These are amazing stories, the ones that we as a field think is the norm, when in fact, unfortunately, in most cases, libraries are only a safe space, a sanctuary for those we deem worthy, for those who are privileged. Whether it's allowing Nazis and TERFs to rent out our meeting rooms and use our spaces, whether it's having a Black Lives Matter display alongside a Blue Lives Matter display, or other whataboutisms. Libraries cannot be safe spaces to everyone if it's a safe space for Nazis, if it's a safe space for TERFs, TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, those who believe that trans women aren't women and that they are in fact men preying on quote unquote normal women. We see that there is legislation sweeping across the nation, doing its best to bring back and or increase legislation saying that certain populations, queer people, trans people, Black people, anyone who doesn't conform to the extremely white, straight, cis, conservative, hegemonic values are being targeted. And as libraries, when we decide to not only allow hate groups to use our spaces, but in many cases, have people who belong to hate groups speak in our spaces, all it shows is that only those who can pass as normal by fascists, right? Those who don't trip any sort of alarms when it comes to gender representation, when it comes to race, when it comes to passing as a certain sexuality. Only those people are the who can be considered safe. I can be in a room with a Nazi and they might feel safe, but I definitely won't, right? And so as we continue to see this legislation move forward across states, across communities, are we going to say, well, libraries are great because they're the last bastions of democracy, they're the soul of the community, they're the last, one of the last non-capitalist spaces, one of, we as a field love to say, oh, if libraries were pitched now, it would be seen as a socialist endeavor and never pass. And while that may be true, when we as a field also continue to uphold white supremacy and ignore more valid critiques, such as workers having a lot of job creep and overwork, are we in fact being a democratic institution? If we're supposed to be a stand-in for democracy, how can we say that we endeavor to be a democratic institution when we don't actually listen to the critiques of many of our, not just library workers, but our communities themselves? A true democratic institution would never attempt to silence huge swaths of the community in a misguided attempt to say, but look at all the good that we do. And so here is the cycle of exploitation that often happens to not just instruction librarians, but most library workers. You have the recruitment phase where a passionate worker is hired by the library. They are sold this idea that we are going to be the library, we're going to make a difference. And then there's a number of abuse and low morale experiences that we as workers are put through. I would definitely encourage reading more about low morale experiences from Katrina Davis Kendrick. She has written about it again in both public and academic library spaces. And so after all of the abuse, after all of the low morale experiences, what happens, right? Burnout, in which the library worker either leaves or retires or changes fields entirely. The Great Resignation that's, and we say that in all caps, right? The Great Resignation that has been causing a reckoning in other fields has not passed us by as library workers. There is definitely a lot of people who are seeing that the abuse is not worth all that is happening, right? The mission of the library isn't enough to bolster and protect from the amount of abuse and low morale experiences that we're experiencing. And so what happens then? Either a new worker is recruited and the cycle begins anew, or perhaps worse, the position isn't replaced and the remaining job duties are then shuffled onto those who are left, giving them yet more work and driving them even more quickly to burnout, letting the cycle just continue over and over and over again. And so it would be impossible to have any presentation, any keynote, and not mention the pandemic. It has been almost 3 years, and instead of me talking about the pandemic, I want all of you in your various spaces, whether you're still working from home or whether you're in your offices, to think about these past 3 years. Did your library close? How long did it take for your library to close? Did it require an executive order from the government? Did it require unions and other advocacy groups to force the issue? When the vaccines finally came around, were you considered essential workers then, or just in the beginning when they wanted you to continue working Are you able to work from home? If not, when was that taken away? How has your library supported you and the instruction, not even just you as an instruction worker, but you just as a person? Has the library supported you, or has it been a race to go back to normal, a race to prove our value, prove the fact that we can still do instruction even during a massive global reckoning? And so when we think about everything that's happened, what is the cost of our service as library instructors, as library workers, as workers in general? Is it just the continuation of the cycle of exploitation and abuse and literally, when we're talking about, again, a deadly disease, death being an option is no longer something that is an extreme example? Not when we have seen countless examples of library organizations having their workers come in to take away mask mandates, have not great HVAC systems, and yet are still expected to work in cubicles in their offices. When there isn't even data on just what we can do to prevent all of the different variants that are running rampant, when one of the biggest professional organizations in the country is still having their annual conference in a small city with, and there are all of these different things that show that death is not the extreme example anymore, but something that we really all, as a field, have to reckon with. And so you might say, well, how do we move forward? If vocational awe is the blueprint, how do we, in fact, fix the foundation? So it might seem like I made kind of a curve from talking just about instruction and instruction programs, but I think, and as I'll talk more now, I think it's really important to acknowledge just what has happened both in our programs, instruction programs, and also the world. Because when it comes to becoming a more equitable instructor, it's understanding what critical library instruction really means. It's understanding how libraries participate in white supremacy and other systems of oppression. It's understanding and seeking ways for librarians and students and all of us to influence and change these systems. And it's more than just instruction. It's a way of thinking about our work as instructors within libraries, within librarianship as a whole, in terms of labor, in terms of cultural capital, in terms of all of these different systems that play a direct role on what the classroom actually looks like. It's talking about culturally sustaining pedagogy. When we create practices that align more with just common experiences of our youths and our students, right? When it comes to examples that we may use within our lesson plans, it's going beyond the current music of the day or the current trends and TikToks or whatever it might be. Of course, that's important. And I would never say not to, lean into all that your students and your patrons are doing, but it's going past that and understanding what their cultural practices are, what their cultural contexts are. And not only that, but offering translatable access to dominant cultural competencies. Our students, our patrons, our colleagues who may not see, because of their own experiences, just how important gender and sexuality and their identities play a role in their work, right? It's not just understanding it, but also understand and teaching your students, teaching your patrons what the dominant narratives are and how their work, their experiences can translate to the competencies that they might need moving forward in the more dominant cultural spaces. When it comes to overwork and job creep, setting boundaries are extremely important. Again, as teachers, as instructors, we are sort of dealing almost with the double whammy of vocational awe, right? The vocational awe that affects education, that affects anyone who works with, especially with teens and young adults, as well as the vocational awe that comes with librarianship, that comes with the idea that we are a stand-in for democracy as a public good. When you have all of that on top of you, it can seem like, well, it's selfish to take a day off. It's selfish to not come in, especially when our students might learn better with in-person chats or whatever it might be. But setting aside time for your loved ones, for your hobbies, for your life is so important. And working collectively can help with hopefully taking some of that pressure off. It's a lot harder to smack the nails that stick up if all of the nails are sticking up, as it were. Whether you're in a unionized place or not, organizing with your coworkers, organizing with your communities, even if you're the only instructor at your organization, here is this, there's a reason for conferences like this, right? The 134 other participants in here also have experience with instruction, also are instructors in some way. Organizing not just within your building, but across your communities are a way to continue to create not just a healthier outlook when it comes to work, but will help with bouncing ideas off of each other when it comes to cultural sustaining pedagogies, when it comes to critical library instruction. We don't want, or at least I know I don't want to continue this current model where grit and resilience and doing more with less is the norm, because it leads to one size fits all instruction that leaves those who can't conform to the most basic everyman identity and cookie cutterness. It leaves all of them behind. And worse, with vocational awe being such a big part of librarianship, it shuts down conversations that would help instructors be more equitable, acknowledging that racism exists in libraries, that transphobia and sexism and homophobia and all of these other things exist in libraries, doesn't take away all the good that it does. Only by actually reframing the role of the instructor to understand all of these systems might actually get us closer to the ideals that we are not currently fulfilling, but claim to have. Thank you.